What is up, Earth's mightiest subscribers? It's Blerd without fear. Welcome back to the channel. All right, today's video, we're going to be talking about X-Men number 30, written by Gerry Duggan with art by Phil Noto. In this issue, something happens that I feel is going to wind up lending some credence to some things that we saw recently in Rise of the Powers of 10, number 1. Now, if you haven't checked out my video for that issue of the latest in the current major story arc of X-Men, you can go check it out up here. But to get into this, one of the things that has happened is that we're getting a callback to an issue of X-Men, Gerry Duggan's X-Men more specifically, that I've actually talked about probably more often than not. And in just the third issue of Gerry Duggan's X-Men run, the High Evolutionary showed up and had attempted to offer the X-Men a gift that was a bioweapon that would sterilize all of humanity, to the point that humanity would instantaneously stop having children and that mutants would be the only types of children that were birthed going forward on the planet Earth. Now, as you might imagine, the X-Men turned this offer down, but the High Evolutionary, being who he is, decided to unleash his Animin on the planet, and Synch was able to broker a ceasefire between the High Evolutionary and the X-Men by offering the villain a drop of his blood, something that we really, to this date, haven't quite figured out what he's done with that blood. But I'm pretty sure we're gonna learn very quickly what that is. But while having a conversation with Spider-Man in this issue, Synch comes up with the idea, just based on Spider-Man casually mentioning the X-Men villain Sauron's desire to turn humans into dinosaurs using a bioweapon, very similar to what I was just talking about. Synch decides to go to the High Evolutionary on Counter Earth to try to retrieve that bioweapon, knowing that the High Evolutionary would not have gotten rid of it. This bioweapon is important because while yes, it would sterilize humanity, that's not exactly what Synch wants to use it for. For those who may have forgotten, prior to the Fall of X kicking off and the Hellfire Gala of 2023 and so on and so forth, Orchis had tampered with the Krakoan medicines that were being given to humans. Inside of these medicines that could cure mental diseases and physical diseases and extend human life, they implanted a backdoor type of control into these medicines that would allow Orchis to activate a human's fight or flight response, something we actually saw play out in Gerry Duggan's X-Men number 22, where MODOK and Dr. Stasis had combined their respective sciences together and were able to turn any human who had used these medicines into either a violent psychopath or into a incredibly suicidal individual. Synch wants to use the High Evolutionary's bioweapon to not sterilize humanity, but to get rid of that backdoor level of control that Orchis has over the humans who are on these medicines. But there's one problem with that, and it's that the High Evolutionary doesn't want to hand it over anymore. And while both he and Talon are able to infiltrate Counter-Earth, even turning some of the High Evolutionary's Animin against him in the process, the High Evolutionary isn't just going to let them walk out with that bioweapon. Despite the fact that he offered it to them in the first place, they turned that offer down, and they're gonna have to put a new offer on the table. Synch and Talon don't even have to lift too much of a finger to tackle one of the High Evolutionary's more singular threats, and that is the character Luminous, a woman who is the genetic combination of Wanda Maximoff, aka the Scarlet Witch, and Pietro Maximoff, aka Quicksilver. She has both of their power sets, and it makes sense considering the fact that both of these characters are also creations of the High Evolutionary, something that was retconned in 2015's Uncanny Avengers number 4. They are not mutants, they are genetic creations of this supervillain, the High Evolutionary. So it would make sense that Luminous is exactly what she appears to be on the tin. Synch is able to quickly shut down Luminous because he is, once again, using the powers of Jean Grey. Despite the fact that she's dead, he can still sync with X genes from memory. Now, this is dangerous for him, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment, but he uses that power to instantaneously shut Luminous down because he's making her remember all of the torture that she has suffered at the hands of the High Evolutionary. And despite the fact that Luminous made the argument that if they could defeat her, they could have their weapon, the High Evolutionary made no such arrangement, and he wants to fight for this weapon. And it's one of those situations where when we get into it, it almost gives the impression that the fight ended incredibly quickly because of the nature of how Jerry Duggan frames it. And it's the whole, oh, this fight ends the way all of Talon and Synch's fights often do, and that's quickly. But this time around, it's not in their favor. We get this big setup earlier in the issue where a lot of the stuff that Synch and Talon are doing on Counter-Earth is written away really quickly because they're very effective and efficient with how they use their powers and their ability to work in tandem with one another, something that shouldn't be a surprise considering that they spent the better part of thousands of years inside of the vault and working together just like this. Synch and Talon take on the High Evolutionary, and they fail. Spectacularly, I might add. And while we know Synch has incredible power and that his power, it does in fact have limits, I think we learn in this issue exactly how a plot point of the Rise of the Powers of 10 #1 issue shows off, and that's that Synch has aged incredibly, that he has aged himself to the point that he can't even walk anymore, that he has the body of an octogenarian. For a guy who should clearly be not much more than in his 30s, he has the body of a frail old man, and we know that the more he uses his power, pushing it to its limits the way that he has, syncing with X genes from memory, the more he does it, and the more power he uses doing it, it ages him every time he does it. Syncing with someone who's within range of him is no problem, but syncing with someone from memory, that is what will age him. And we learn in this issue, Talon did not survive the fight with the High Evolutionary. The High Evolutionary destroyed Talon, effectively burning her up from the inside out to the point that she is nothing more than a black stain on the floor. But before the High Evolutionary could completely kill Talon, Synch, using Jean's powers, had moved Talon's mind from her body and into his own, effectively making him a human cerebro unit. And when he talks to Talon, it's as if she's sitting right next to him, she's standing right there, but no one else can see her. So it looks like Synch is just talking to himself. And while we don't get any indication exactly of what Synch is going to do, I think I know what Synch is going to try to do, and that is going to be to try to sync with all of the other members of the Five using their abilities and doing this from memory to try to bring Talon back. Now, this isn't something that he's incapable of doing. It's just something that would be very dangerous for him to try to do. He's been around the Five before and has likely tried to sync with their X genes before when we were reintroduced to Synch during Jonathan Hickman's X-Men run. One of the things that was brought up that Synch was actually looked at as a possible replacement for Hope Summers should she become unavailable, so that way he would be able to aid in the resurrection of mutants alongside the rest of the Five. Synch's power is really not that much different from Hope Summers, whereas Hope Summers can take another mutant's power if they're within proximity of herself. Synch can do the exact same thing. The only major difference is that he's not a power maximizer in the way that Hope Summers is, where she can maximize other mutants' powers. Synch doesn't necessarily do that for other mutants. He can do it for himself. Synch does have the ability to take another mutant's powers and be able to use them at their maximum levels. We can go back to his days in Generation X. We saw that Synch was able to sync with the character Chamber, and it was revealed that Chamber had the capacity to fly, something that Chamber himself didn't know he could do. We've also seen Synch link up with other characters and use their powers in ways that they didn't realize they could before. And when he does sync with another person's powers, regardless of whether they're human or mutant, he knows immediately all the best ways to use that person's abilities. So that's kind of the difference between Hope and Synch. But yeah, Synch would be able to do this. He would probably even find some ways to do it more efficiently than what the Five could potentially do, but he would very likely have to use each and every member's powers in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And it's not like he doesn't know how to do this because, once again, he has practiced in doing this with the five, and he has been around the five, so it's not like he wouldn't be able to recall them on some level. But doing this, I imagine, trying to use these powers and also trying to combine all these powers together would very likely be what could potentially age him that considerably in such a short amount of time, because the first issue of Rise of the Powers of 10 only takes place 10 years in the future. Aging 40 to 50 years in a span of 10, I'd imagine he either A, used his powers a lot, or he did something incredibly massive that would have done it for him. There's some other stuff going on here in this issue too. We kind of revisit Cyclops in his prison in Paris, France, where Orchis is basically holding him there and trying to get him ready to stand trial, as we saw in Fall of the House of X #1. We already know about what's going on here. Basically, what we're just getting here is more flavor to add to it. The fact that Orchis is, knowingly putting Cyclops up to this, and while Cyclops is giving some pretty dead giveaways that Orchis is just ignoring, it's because Orchis, they feel they've already won. They don't feel they have to pay attention to the little minor details the way they probably would have before. Kind of the same way that, people felt about the X-Men when the X-Men kicked off with Krakoa and how they were just ignoring these little teeny tiny details the X-Men probably would not have ignored before. Orchis is committing the exact same sins right now. The fact that Cyclops is literally telling the psychologist that he's talking to Jean, that he is having conversations with Jean, that Jean is very much alive. She's just not here and there in the present day as anyone else would perceive it. And the psychologist, which I think is kind of funny considering that they live in a world where superheroes are a thing, and knowing that there are telepaths out there, but they still don't know enough to take what Cyclops says seriously about Jean. The fact that she is in fact there, he is actually talking to her. It's just not in a way anyone else would perceive but him. And the fact that Dr. Stasis is ignoring this. He just wants Cyclops cleared so that he can stand on trial, regardless of whether he actually tries to defend himself or not, or even if he's actually medically capable of doing so, despite the fact Orchis has been torturing him day and night. All that matters is that they get what they want, and they don't care who they have to strong arm to do it. They're gonna get whatever they want by hook or by crook. And while we also do see some stuff going on between Firestar and Iron Man, some stuff that I'll probably talk a little bit more about in another video because it comes up there as well, but just know that Iron Man and Firestar, they are setting the table right now to bring Orchis down once and for all. And then, like I said, I'll talk a little bit more about it on that side of things, just because I kind of feel like we're already kind of going over here just with this alone. I feel like Synch and Talon are, the real lion's share of the story going on here. But just make sure, stay tuned. The video for Invincible Iron Man number 14 is not going to take me 2 or 3 weeks to do like it did before, because I'm not quite as busy right now. I'm busy, but you get the idea. All I will say is making your own comic is hard. Not only is it hard, it's also time consuming. But that said, I enjoyed this issue. It was fantastic. It was good. It did everything it needed to do. I like what's being set up here, and I like that, they're still keeping us with, a story that matters in this, despite the fact that, we got House of X and, the Powers of 10 2 sequel already kicked off, which is a huge difference, and I think people don't think about this, is that when the original House of X and Powers of 10 came out, there was no X-Men title. There were no other X titles coming out at the time, but right now we're still getting, some X titles while the Fall and Rise are coming out. So that's actually pretty cool, and it kind of helps fill in the gaps on a lot of what's going on here. Solid issue. Can't wait to see what happens next, and I'm curious to see exactly what Jerry Duggan's going to do with Synch here in this, because there's a lot of avenues that he could take, but I feel like there's one that makes the most sense, and I'm curious to see if Jerry's gonna do it. You guessed it, obligatory channel outro time. If you're not subscribed to the channel, consider doing so. Clicking that subscribe button and tapping that notification bell ensures that you get more videos just like this one, and you don't miss any of my other content that I drop throughout the week, plus my live streams every Thursday and Saturday. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure you click that like button, keep it plus ultra, and sound off in the comments.